Hey, welcome class to week 4. We are on the home stretch with the Great Omission, and now we'll be shortly turning our attention to John Ortberg. And so I'm excited about a little bit of change of pace coming up soon. But for this week's video content, we're going to spend some time looking at the concept of Sabbath as it pertains to rest and specifically silence and solitude. I was struck by with the end there, Willard kind of chronicling some books from Frank Laubach to Teresa of Avila to Ruth Haley Barton. That book, An Invitation to Silence and Solitude, has been a huge influence in my own life and would commend that book to you. It's a little easier to read than The Castle. Teresa of Avila's book, it's a little more accessible, so I would encourage you to jump in on that specifically. So let's talk about Sabbath for a few moments, because I believe it's the critical placeholder in life, if you will, for experiencing the real rest that comes from silence, out of silence and solitude. For the longest time, I did not consider myself a contemplative. I said, rest, not my primary value. I've got a lot of work to do for the Lord, and so I'll leave rest for the more contemplative people around me. And the Lord used a set of circumstances to get my attention, and those circumstances were not fun. Almost a decade ago, went through a kind of physical malady that was the result of accumulated stress in my life, a lack of rest, and really went through a hard time. And the Lord used that to get my attention and say, Chris, you've got to rest. Doesn't matter whether you feel like you're wired up to rest, you got to do it. I believe that rest, and specifically Sabbath, is a command of God. It's a non-negotiable in the Christian life. And so we're going to spend a few minutes looking at rest. And I just want you to look at your life. I want you to look at your life, because I think a lot of pastors and people who are in leadership, and every one of us in this room, in this class rather, we're here because we're in ministry or desiring to be in ministry. And I know a lot of pastors and leaders who don't do a good job of resting. We burn the candle at both ends and then wonder sometimes why we feel like we're running out of steam, running out of gas. So what I'm going to say to you comes into my own life as a hard-fought battle. This was something that I resisted for many years, but the Lord is using it to make a real impact in my own life and in my own soul. So you'll see me looking down occasionally. It's just because I want to keep myself on track and have enough clarity with regard to some notes to share with you. So for me, Sabbath is all about leisure. And many of us think, I don't have any time for leisure, because we think of leisure as sort of wasted time or hobbies that are useless, distracting even. I know people, myself included, for the longest time, I thought leisure is for lazy people, and I'm not lazy, so I got no time for leisure. I don't even know how I would justify leisure. I want to define leisure for us in a more classical sense, not the way I just described it. Leisure is this. Joseph Pieper, in his book, Leisure as the Basis of Culture, it's a great little book, a philosophical treatment of leisure. This is what he says. He says, leisure is a mental and spiritual attitude. It is not the result of external factors. Hear that. It is not the result of external factors. It is not the inevitable result of spare time. It's not a holiday, a weekend, or a vacation. Leisure is, in the first place, an attitude of mind and a condition of the soul. Hear this. Leisure is the space that we create that allows us to think deep thoughts and to see things more clearly. It's not a vacation. It's not a time where we check out. It's not a time where we veg out or go on a vacation because we're burned out. Leisure is the space created to think clearly, to think creatively, and to actually problem solve. Leisure is what Jesus was doing when he climbed mountains to be alone. He went away, if you read the Gospels, right? He went away often so that when he was with people, he could truly be with them. He'd be helpful when he was with them. I would submit to you that you need to cultivate spaces of leisure in your life if you're going to be helpful and useful when you're with people. If you want your sermons to carry moral authority, you need to be a person of leisure. If you want the curriculums that you write to impact people's souls, you need to be a person of leisure. You must be alone and apart in order to have the space to be really useful and innovative and effective when you are with people. So leisure is a critical thing. I would submit to you that Sabbath is the way that we find leisure. But it's hard. It's hard for us. It's difficult for us to find Sabbath. I'm going to read to you a passage you already know. This is from Hebrews 4. The writer Paul says this, "So then, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God." It's not out of date. It's not outmoded. It's not an Exodus 20 thing, and now we're New Testament people. The writer says Sabbath is still available. He says, "For those who enter God's rest also cease from their labors as God did from his." God did it first. We follow him. And then listen to this. This is the kicker. He says, "Let us therefore make every effort to enter into that rest, so that no one may fall through such disobedience as theirs." So the writer says we have to make an effort. One translation even says, strive to enter the rest. Now you're supposed to feel the irony in those words, that we have to strive or engage in an active effort in order to enter into rest, work hard to enter into a place of not working hard. We're supposed to feel the tension in that phrase. You and me, we have to strive to enter the rest. I would submit to you that we live in a culture, a world today that will never give us permission to rest. We'll never feel ready to rest. We'll never feel like we have caught up, got it all done, and therefore rest is easy. We have to actually make intentional choices about entering into the rest. And that's what I'm going to do for the next little bit of time. So I'm going to challenge you to make intentional choices about entering into rest. You cannot flourish apart from Sabbath keeping. I'm going to say it again. You cannot flourish apart from regular Sabbath keeping. If you're too busy, you need to carve out some time and make some changes. And we're all busy. We all have stuff to do. We all work hard. But God said, "I will work 6 days and rest one." And he calls humans to work 6 days and rest one. I engage in a full 6-day work week. And that means Saturday for me is a Sabbath. Saturday is a 24-hour period of time where I do not work. You're not going to hear as much from me via email and all those things when it comes to Saturdays. I'll only respond to crisis or emergency. And even in our church context, we spread those things out among our team. So here's how I'm going to define Sabbath. Sabbath is a 24-hour period of time where you step back from anxiety, you step back from productivity, and you stop. The Hebrew word Sabbath literally just means stop. It's not an inherently religious word. It means stop, cease, quit, take a break. Sabbath doesn't mean endless religious activity. Sabbath doesn't mean deep piety, praying hard all day. Sabbath doesn't mean churchy activities that you drag your children into. Sabbath doesn't mean do things that are hard just because they're good for your soul. Sabbath means to stop. It just means to cease. Sabbath means to stop being productive. Sabbath just means you need to rest. Sabbath means that for us to be fully present, we have to be people of leisure. And Sabbath is the space where I learn leisure. And I want to say to you with small kids, you can do Sabbath with your kids. It may not be as sublime as it will be later when your kids are older, or for those of you who don't have kids, Sabbath is a great opportunity to lay in a hammock and, sleep or whatever, read your favorite book uninterrupted. If you have small kids, that's not going to be your experience. Sabbath is going to feel a little different for you, but it's still possible. You can take your kids outside. You can go for a hike. You can cook and eat a great meal. Sabbath is a thing that has to work depending on your stage of life, but I would encourage you, don't let yourself off the hook by saying, well, I've got little kids, so Sabbath isn't for me. It is for you. It'll just look a little differently than it will when your kids are older. But we all have to do something to step back from productivity and just to be. So I'm going to read 2 verses that you're familiar with. One from Exodus 20, and the other one is almost identical, but it has a nuanced difference from Deuteronomy 5. Here are the words from Moses regarding Sabbath. So listen to the Bible, even though you've heard these texts before. The writer says, "Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the resident alien in your town." Everybody stops on the Sabbath, even the animals. "For in 6 days The Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Now, I'm going to tell you something else about Exodus 20 that you probably know already but need reminding of. So the Lord there took 3 verses to tell us about Sabbath keeping. Do you know how many verses Moses takes to tell us not to murder in that same passage? 1. It's interesting. We needed 1 verse committed to don't murder, 3 committed to keep the Sabbath. It's almost as if God knew, in some ways, it would be easier for us to refrain from murdering than to keep the Sabbath. So he gives us a rationale. It's actually the only of the 10 commandments that comes with a deep rationale for why we ought to keep it and honor that commandment. Listen to this one from Deuteronomy 5. Very similar with one very important difference. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God commanded you. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you or your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your ox or your donkey, or any of your livestock, or the resident aliens in your town, so that your male and female slaves may rest as well as you. So that's the same. Listen to this. Verse 15. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. So here's the important thing that we need to hear from that passage. The Lord was reminding the Israelites that they were in former captivity. And so what he was saying is, by stepping back from compulsory behavior, you remember that you used to be a captive, but you're now a free man, a free woman. And I will say that this is what's relevant for us in this passage. Sabbath keeping reminds me that there were things and are things in my life that used to hold me captive. Your job can hold you captive. Your appetites can hold you captive. Certain relationships can hold you captive and create almost a kind of bondage. When we keep the Sabbath, what we're doing in part is acknowledging that we have a tendency to allow things to take us captive, to hold us captive, and yet God's called us to be a free person, a free man, a free woman. So when I keep the Sabbath, I remember my work used to own me. My work used to control me. But now God has called me to step out from that controlling me so that I live my life as a free person. How might your life be different if you lived with a sense of freedom about you? What Sabbath keeping does for me, and I believe that this is true for everyone who keeps it, is it's an invitation to live free, to do the things that we do and have the responsibilities that we have, but to do that with an air of lightness about us, an air of freedom about us. And so the Lord wants you to be free. He wants you to live your life free. And one of the ways that we affirm our essential freedom is to be Sabbath keepers. We step back from the things that would control us and we rest. So remember that you are slaves. Remember that you have things that could take control over you and maybe have. And Sabbath is a way for us to affirm our essential freedom. Here's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't keep the Sabbath. We hate as Christians, and specifically as Christian leaders, to admit that we're beginners. You want to be an expert. It's human nature to want to be an expert. Pastors love to be experts. We like to be right. We like to know. We like to feel proficient. So what we do a lot of times as Christians and Christian leaders is we avoid things that we're not good at. For me, this was why I avoided rest and Sabbath keeping for the long time, because I knew I wasn't good at it. So I was like, well, I'm going to leave that to other people. I'm good at thinking, writing, speaking, getting stuff done. One of the great gifts of Sabbath keeping, and I would say we're in a spiritual formation class, one of the great gifts of the spiritual disciplines is that they are always in the spiritual disciplines is an invitation for you to admit that you're a beginner, that we'll all always be beginners in some fundamental sense. So for me, specifically, Sabbath keeping is an invitation for me to realize I'm not great at this. This is not my natural inclination. I'm not a contemplative by nature, but the Lord asked me to do it anyway. So, one other thing before I get into to 4 pretty important ideas. Sabbath is about input into our lives. And the Ignatian spiritual way talks to us about consolation, things that input into us, and desolation, things that take from us. You could think of it simply as input, output, things that fill your tank, things that drain your tank. I will say this, life and ministry is full of things that drain your tank. And you can't avoid these things. There are things that I have to do every day that I don't like to do. They're inescapable. What happens to us when we don't do things that fill our tank, and rest and Sabbath and silence and solitude, these things fill our tank, is that we run out of gas. And some of us in this class, you're running out of gas. You feel like your tank's empty. And I would submit to you that if you were to step back and look at your life, you might find that you're not resting enough. You're not sleeping enough. You're not pulling back to rest. You think, I'll have time, or I'll rest when I get caught up. I'm going to speak to that in a few minutes. You're never going to feel ready to rest. You're never going to feel like everything's finished. You have to make choices about this. So we have to actually tend to input, or else the inevitable outputs of life will run us dry. If you stop putting fuel in your car and keep driving it, your car will stop working. And it's not because the car's broken. It's because the car's not receiving adequate input. You are no different from your automobile. You have to do inputs. Otherwise, the outputs will run you ragged. A book I would commend to you, especially today, if you feel like I am possibly entering the early stages of burnout. I was there. This happened to me. Thanks be to God, it's not where I am now, and I don't think I'm going to get back there because of these inputs and outputs, and specifically rest, Sabbath keeping. If you're in that place, though, I would commend to you Wayne Cordero's little book called Leading on Empty. Wayne Cordero, he's a Hawaiian pastor. He had a nervous breakdown, effectively, a collapse due to stress. And he wrote this book called Leading on Empty. And he speaks in this book about inputs and outputs. You should read that book if you're in a place of any difficulty, or even if you feel like there are some like blinking lights on the dashboard of your life saying, I think I'm running a little low. It's not a crisis, but I could get to a crisis. Catch it before you fall apart. Really important. Wayne Cordero's Leading on Empty. And the reason why I think rest is so important is that so much of our sin arises due to a lack of sustainability. So many of the things that will arise in your life that will undermine your credibility and moral authority will come because you're depleted. Think about this, guys. Jesus was tempted after he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights. It says he was depleted, and the enemy came to him to tempt him. Your life is going to be no different. Same for me. The enemy will come to me to tempt me when I'm at my most vulnerable. Rest is a way to strengthen yourself so that when temptation comes, you're able to withstand. So I'm going to say 4 things, and these things come from Pete Scazzero. He's a pastor, was a pastor in New York City. Now he leads Emotionally Healthy Leadership. He wrote the book Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. Wonderful. I subscribe to Pete's podcast, Emotionally Healthy Leader. If you're going to subscribe to one podcast right now, I would say you should subscribe to Emotionally Healthy Leader. So good. And if you're going to subscribe to 2, I would say This Cultural Moment, John Mark Comer's podcast, pastor up in Portland. So good. These 2 are great. But Scazzero tends to the inner life. He says 4 things about Sabbath keeping, and this is what I'm going to do here at the end. First, stop. Like I said, the word Sabbath is not a religious word. It means stop. And I'm going to tell you, you have to make a choice when it comes to stopping. We're never going to feel ready. We're never going to feel caught up. We're never going to feel like, oh, it's all done, so I can stop. I can make this work now. That day will never come for you. You have to actually make a disciplined choice to say, I'm going to put a flag in the ground and stop. For me, Saturday is a day when I just choose to stop. So that means I write my sermon on Tuesday. Don't write your sermons on Saturday if it's your Sabbath, because I'm going to tell you, if you're a pastor, it is not a Sabbath if you are writing. Nope, you got to stop. We have to make a choice to stop. We have to step back and say, I'm going to cease productivity and activity one day a week. Sabbath means to cease. Sabbath is not religious inherently. Sabbath just means I'm going to stop counting. I'm going to stop measuring. I'm going to stop responding to emails. I'm just going to step back. One of the reasons why we have a hard time stopping is that we have a fear of letting go. We have a fear of being out of control. We have a fear of not being responsible. And one of the gifts of Sabbath keeping is it's an invitation for me to open up my hands and trust God with the people and the responsibilities in my life. It's an opportunity for me to realize that I'm not God. It's an opportunity for me to realize that the church will continue to go, that responsibilities will continue to be there. They'll be ready for me when I get back to them on Sunday or Monday or whenever. That I can take a step back for one day and I can just choose to let go. And I would say that when we choose to let go at first, all kinds of things will emerge in us. Henry Nouwen, in his little book, The Way of the Heart, he said the minute we start to engage in solitude and rest, it's like monkeys shaking in the top of the tree. All these ideas, all these things we have to do just kind of pop out of nowhere to get our attention, to pull us back into a place of frantic activity. So we have to recognize that learning to let go, opening these hands, is really hard work at first. That's why the writer of Hebrews said we have to strive to enter into the rest. You actually have to do it even when it feels uncomfortable. It's hard, difficult, but we have to choose. That leads to the second piece. So stop and then rest. Listen to this. This is really important because I'm going to define rest. Rest is what happens once you've made a habit out of stopping. I'm going to say it again. Rest is what happens once you've made a habit out of stopping. Rest will not happen immediately. Immediately when we stop, we feel more anxious, we feel more frantic, we feel more responsible. Rest only happens after you've committed to stopping and you do it on a regular basis. This is why God tells us that we need to engage in a weekly Sabbath, because we need to stop on a regular, repeatable, predictable pattern so that our bodies and our minds actually learn how to rest. Rest is what happens once you learn to exhale and let go. And that takes time. And frankly, for a lot of Christians, we never get to rest because we never consistently stop. What happens when we learn to rest is that we finally experience recreation. And for many of us, recreation is just frantic activity that we engage on the weekend for which we're not paid. So recreation is like busyness that you do outside of your job. But I want you to think about that word. Recreation means to be recreated. It means to be renewed at your center, to be recreated by God. And I'm going to tell you, we desperately need recreation. It's the heart of leisure. But you won't be a recreated human unless you rest, and you won't rest unless you stop in a repeatable, predictable, significant way every week. Period. And a lack of rest eats at our souls. A lack of rest actually erodes us. And a lot of us don't really realize how tired we are. A lot of us, because we don't stop, we don't realize how exhausted we are. That's why for you, when you go on a vacation, all of a sudden your body lets down and you feel like you're getting sick sometimes. Or you go on a vacation and you realize, I didn't know I was this tired. All I want to do is sleep. It's because what happens is when we're humming all the time, our body doesn't let down because it doesn't feel permission to let down. Once you start to rest on a regular basis, your body's going to begin to tell you how much you need it, how tired you are, how distracted you are, how worn out you are. And one of the things I've learned about rest is if we don't do it on purpose, if we don't do it intentionally, we'll get sick, or we'll have some sort of a breakdown, or something will happen that'll force us. My dad used to say, son, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. It's better to do it the easy way. It's better to be proactive about rest. Otherwise, your body will force you to rest. Or a relationship will blow up in your life that will force you to step back. So we either need to do it on purpose, or we're going to have these uncomfortable opportunities to engage. And back to our bodies, I will say that when it comes to your body is oftentimes like the blinking red lights on the dashboard of your life. Your body is going to tell you, if you'll learn to pay attention to it, when you are lacking in the arena of rest and cessation of activity. So it could be like stress in the shoulders. It could be, stomach malady. It could be a sense of heart racing, anxiety. These things are oftentimes a kind of indicator, a flashing light, if you will, that it's time for you to tend to rest in your soul. So pay attention to those indicators and then start stopping on a regular basis so that rest, which is a habitual result of habitual stopping, so a result of habitual stopping, rest will begin to come into play in your life. That leads us to the third movement. So we have stop, we have rest, and then delight. Pete Scazzero talks about delight, and he basically says delight is what happens when you begin to experience joy. This is a reminder that Sabbath is not supposed to be, silence and solitude are not supposed to be grueling activities. You're supposed to actually have a good time. For me, Sabbath means fun things. It means eating good things, drinking good things, going outside with people I love and care about. Sabbath is supposed to be something that brings a sense of joy to your heart. I'm a big green egg guy, so I like, for those of you who know what those are, it's a smoker, a grill. And I will smoke meat sometimes on a Saturday because I like it. I like the way it smells. I like the process. I like all that's involved in it. And that brings delight. That's actually a Sabbath activity for me, to do things that bring delight. The Bible tells us in Psalm 16 of the Lord, it says, "In your right hand are pleasures forevermore." God wants you to recognize that you are meant to experience delight. So Sabbath should be fun. It should be a good thing. It should be something you enjoy doing with the people around you. This could sound racy. I hope not. But I would say a few things that you do on the Sabbath. You go outside. You eat and drink good food. You make love if you're married. This is an opportunity to be in spaces that bring joy and happiness and satisfaction to your soul. So think of those things and do those things on the Sabbath. Those are holy things to the Lord, fun things. The Jews took Sabbath so seriously that they said mourning, grieving, was actually forbidden on the Sabbath. So they took this call to delight so seriously that they were like, listen, you can't be wearing black, sackcloth and ashes on the Sabbath. You got to do things that are going to fill your tank and have revelry and laughing. You need to be laughing more on the Sabbath than you do any other day of the week. You need to be outside more than you are any time regarding the rest of your week. A discipline of play, if you will. And that leads us to the last one. So stop, rest, delight. The last one is contemplate. Contemplation is what happens when you are habituated to rest and you're doing things that you enjoy. Contemplation is simply beginning to notice things that you otherwise would miss. Contemplation is what happens when we stop and smell the roses. And frankly, some of us in this group, we're just too serious. Life is too serious. It's too important for you to actually feel like contemplation is something you deserve to do. It's not only something you deserve to do, it's something God calls you to do. You'll be a better preacher when you're a delighted, contemplative person. You're actually going to speak and coach or disciple or mentor in a way that's going to have the life of God, the energy of God about it. You need to be contemplative. And like I said at the beginning of this, for the longest time I said, I'm not a contemplative. That's somebody else's job. That's Thomas Merton's job. And what I realized was that what I was really saying was there was a sense of poverty in my soul that I wasn't stopping. I wasn't giving myself permission to step back from duty and obligation and responsibility. The Lord wants you to be a person that notices things. And I'm going to tell you, if you're in pastoral counseling and you're not engaging in regular rest, you're going to be reactive in your counseling rather than a person who notices things, who sees and spots the life of God, even in a painful story, who's able to see where the Lord's working, that little golden thread, and be able to point it out. That's the result of a life lived in Sabbath keeping. That you become a person who notices, who sees the thing that maybe you would have otherwise missed. And I'm going to say you cannot contemplate if you're in a hurry. Period. If you're in a hurry, if there's no space in your week, you won't be contemplative. And if you're not contemplative, I'm just going to tell you, you're not going to be a very good pastor. You may grow a big church as a CEO, but you won't be the kind of person who has that quality of life about you. It goes back to what Willard said. People aren't going to remember the things that you say or even care that much about the ministries you build. They're going to remember the kind of person you are. And the Lord wants us to do that. So I'm going to just leave it there today. I want you to pick a day. And if picking a day, which let's be clear, Sabbath keeping biblically is a 24-hour period of time. And for the Jews, Sabbath began at sundown and went to sundown the next day. So that's great. It means you get halfway through your day while you're sleeping. So that's good. It's like a foothold. So if Sabbath keeping feels impossible to you, if a 24-hour period of time feels impossible, go to bed at a decent hour and then try to hold on to Sabbath keeping until lunchtime on Saturday. That would be a start. It gets you through like more than half a Sabbath day. But I don't want us to let ourselves off the hook. Every one of us in this group, we need to commit to pushing toward a 24-hour period of time where we're not doing sermon writing, emailing. We're not doing things that are productivity and compensated oriented. We are trying to be the kind of people that the Lord wants us to be. You are called by God to be a woman or a man of leisure, to cultivate an inner disposition out of which come the words you say, the productivity, the responsibility. You need to be coming from a place of rest, like Jesus climbing the mountain, so that when you come down the mountain, you actually have something of substance to give. God bless you. See you at our live session on Monday night. We're going to be unpacking those 4 big ideas that Brooks put forth in that lecture. So revisit your notes. We'll talk about it soon. God bless. Bye.